The day my sister carried champagne into the house I'd spent 3 years helping save my parents applauded like she'd earned every brick. She looked straight at me and smiled. You were never the owner, Reagan. You were just convenient. Then a county clerk slid the certified deed across the counter, paused at one line, and frowned. That's odd, he murmured. The name listed beside the property wasn't the one anyone expected. In that moment, I realized losing my dream home wasn't the real betrayal. Someone had been hiding the truth long before Helen Carter died. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, tell me your country and what time it is where you are right now. I'd love to know who's here with me today, and if stories about family truth and standing up for yourself resonate with you, consider subscribing so you won't miss what happened after that single line on the deed changed everything. 3 years earlier, I had never imagined an old Victorian house would become the center of the deepest fracture in my family. Back then, it was simply another client file. I was a commercial real estate attorney in Charlotte, North Carolina. Most of my work involved shopping centers, office leases, zoning disputes, and development agreements. Historic homes rarely crossed my desk because they generated more paperwork than profit, and most law firms preferred clients with bigger budgets. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, a nonprofit preservation group called our office asking whether anyone could spend an hour reviewing a notice from the city. An elderly homeowner was facing fines after replacing several damaged windows without obtaining approval from the Historic District Commission. Every senior attorney declined. The case wouldn't generate meaningful revenue. I volunteered. That decision changed my life. The address was on East Worthington Avenue in Dilworth, one of Charlotte's oldest neighborhoods. The house stood beneath towering oak trees whose branches stretched across the sidewalk like protective arms. White paint peeled from the wooden siding. The wraparound porch leaned slightly from age, but every spindle, every carved railing, every stained glass window hinted at a century of careful craftsmanship. Even neglected, it possessed a quiet dignity. An elderly woman opened the front door before I reached the porch. You must be the attorney who agreed to waste an afternoon on an old woman. She smiled before I could answer. I'm Helen Carter. I laughed. I'm Reagan Jenkins, and I don't think this is a waste of an afternoon. She stepped aside. Then come see why the city thinks my windows are a public emergency. The living room felt like stepping into another era. Original hardwood floors creaked beneath every step. Family photographs covered nearly every wall. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Instead of expensive decorations, every room displayed decades of ordinary life birthday parties, graduations, military uniforms, wedding portraits, grandchildren sitting on porch swings. Nothing looked staged. Everything looked lived in. Helen spread city notices across her dining room table. I replaced 3 rotten windows after a storm, she explained. The contractor said they matched the originals. Apparently, the commission disagrees. I spent nearly 2 hours reviewing ordinances, permit requirements, and inspection reports. Finally, I looked up. They're partly right, Helen sighed. I figured. But they're also ignoring a preservation exception. She raised one eyebrow. There is... I turned my laptop toward her. The ordinance allows emergency structural repairs when documented properly. Your contractor filed photographs with the city, but nobody attached them to your review file. She stared at me. So, someone lost the evidence. Looks that way. Helen chuckled softly. I've learned something after 78 years. What's that? The truth doesn't disappear. It just gets buried under paperwork. That sentence stayed with me long after I left. Over the next 2 weeks, I contacted inspectors, tracked archived files, located missing photographs, and prepared a formal response. The city withdrew the fines. Helen insisted on paying my legal bill. I declined. It only took a few hours. It took knowledge, she corrected. Knowledge has value. It does. So let me repay you somehow. I smiled. You already have. She looked genuinely confused. You reminded me why I became a lawyer. From then on, she occasionally called whenever another issue appeared. Sometimes it involved tax notices, sometimes insurance questions. Sometimes she simply wanted someone to explain legal language she didn't understand. None of the questions were urgent. None paid particularly well, yet I never regretted making time. Some clients measured success by money. Helen measured it by trust. A few months later, she invited me for coffee after we finished reviewing property tax paperwork. While pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, she glanced toward the staircase. My husband built those shelves himself. She pointed toward the library. He said houses remember the people who care for them. I smiled politely. I'm not sure houses can remember. She looked at me over the rim of her mug. Maybe not. But people do. Over time, our meetings stopped feeling like appointments. I'd arrive after work. She would bake cornbread or peach cobbler. We talked about everything from neighborhood history to architecture, local politics, and books we'd both enjoyed. She never treated me like hired help. She asked questions about my life, my career, my hopes. One evening, she noticed me staring through the front window. It's beautiful when the sun hits those stained glass panels. It is. I've always dreamed of restoring a house like this someday. Helen smiled. You don't dream about owning a mansion. I shook my head. I don't care about square footage. I care about preserving something that matters. She became unusually quiet. Then she simply nodded. I thought so. I didn't realize how carefully she observed people. She noticed everything. If I arrived tired, dinner was already waiting. If I mentioned a stressful case, she'd leave newspaper clippings about similar legal disputes on the table. She remembered conversations months later. Nothing escaped her attention. Around the same time, my parents finally visited the house. Richard Jenkins slowly walked around the exterior with folded arms. It's an old money pit. I smiled. It's one of the best preserved Victorian homes left in Dilworth. He shrugged. Still costs a fortune. Susan admired the flower beds, but seemed more interested in asking whether Helen had children. No, Helen answered. My husband and I never did. Susan looked almost disappointed. Later, while driving home, she glanced toward me. You spend an awful lot of time helping her. I enjoy it. Just don't become emotionally attached. I frowned. Why would you say that? People get strange around valuable property. At the time, I assumed she was simply being practical. Looking back, I wonder whether that sentence revealed more than she intended. Vanessa finally visited several months later. She arrived wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a camera. Oh my gosh, she said as soon as she stepped onto the porch. This place is incredible. She asked Helen whether she could photograph the staircase, the fireplace, the stained glass windows, the garden. She posted nearly 20 pictures online that afternoon. Her caption read, "Spending the day with one of Charlotte's hidden architectural treasures." Thousands of people admired the photographs. Dozens commented about how wonderful it was that Vanessa volunteered with seniors. I stared at my phone. Volunteered. She had been there for less than 45 minutes. Helen noticed my expression. Does that bother you? A little. Because it isn't true. Helen gently stirred her tea. Recognition is one of the easiest things to borrow. Character isn't. I tried to let it go. Vanessa had always been charismatic. She could walk into any room and leave people believing she had been the center of every important moment. That had been true since childhood. When I won debate competitions, people congratulated my parents for raising two remarkable daughters before somehow turning the conversation toward Vanessa's latest accomplishment. When I graduated from law school, dinner somehow became a celebration of Vanessa closing another luxury home sale. I stopped expecting equal attention years earlier. Still seeing it happen with Helen unsettled me. The following Saturday, I arrived carrying folders filled with preservation grant applications I'd spent 3 evenings researching. Helen looked genuinely surprised. "You did all this? If you're approved, the grants could help cover exterior restoration without increasing your property taxes." She slowly turned each page. Detailed notes, application deadlines, estimated funding, contractor requirements, historic preservation incentives. She didn't say anything for nearly a minute. Finally, she closed the folder. "Reagan." "Yes." "You always solve the problem nobody else notices." I laughed. "That's basically my job." "No." She smiled softly. "I think it's who you are." Then she walked into her study and unlocked a tall oak filing cabinet. Every drawer contained neatly labeled folders: insurance, taxes, property surveys, permits, contracts, photographs, maintenance records. Nothing was out of place. She returned holding a slim blue folder. "I've spent 50 years learning one lesson." She placed the folder gently on the table between us. "People forget conversations. They forget promises. But documents." She rested one hand on the folder. "Documents remember everything." I looked at the perfectly organized files and smiled. As an attorney, I couldn't agree more. Helen smiled back, but there was something thoughtful in her eyes that I didn't fully understand. Then she quietly said words that would echo in my mind years later. "One day, Reagan, you'll understand why I insisted that every important decision be put in writing." By the following spring, helping Helen Carter had quietly become part of my routine. Not because she needed constant legal advice. Because somewhere along the way, she had become family in every way that mattered. Every Wednesday after work, I'd stop by with groceries if she texted that her knees were bothering her. Every other Friday, we'd review whatever mail had accumulated on her dining room table: insurance renewals, tax notices, utility statements, preservation updates from the Historic District Commission. Most of it required nothing more than explanation. Helen always insisted on understanding every document before signing it. "I survived long enough to know that signatures are expensive," she'd often joke. "They don't always cost money. Sometimes they cost peace." As an attorney, I appreciated that mindset. Most legal disasters didn't begin with dramatic fraud. They started because someone trusted another person to handle the paperwork. Helen trusted almost no one with paperwork, except me. One Wednesday afternoon, I noticed she climbed the porch steps much slower than usual. "You okay?" "Oh, just getting older." She smiled like she always did, but halfway through making tea, she gripped the kitchen counter for balance. I immediately drove her to her physician. Several appointments later, specialists confirmed what Helen had quietly suspected. Congestive heart failure, manageable for now. Progressive. There wasn't a dramatic hospital scene, no emotional speeches. Just a calm cardiologist explaining medications, dietary changes, and regular monitoring. Helen listened without interrupting. Then she thanked the doctor for being honest. When we walked outside, she looked toward the parking lot. "I've had 78 wonderful years." I was hoping for more. I didn't know what to say. She laughed softly. "That's why people your age make good company." "You still expect more time." I remember to appreciate the time that's left. From that day forward, I adjusted my schedule. Nothing dramatic. I simply rearranged meetings whenever possible. If Helen needed transportation, I drove. If contractors needed access to the property, I coordinated schedules. If insurance companies requested documents, I handled the correspondence. Sometimes we'd spend an entire afternoon doing nothing more exciting than sorting receipts into labeled folders. Oddly enough, those became some of my favorite days. She had a way of turning ordinary moments into meaningful conversations. One afternoon, while organizing maintenance invoices dating back nearly 20 years, I asked, "Why do you keep everything?" She smiled. "Because memory argues." "Paper doesn't." I laughed. "You really don't trust memories." "I trust memories for birthdays." She held up an old contractor invoice. "I trust documents for everything else." That sentence would prove far more important than either of us realized. About 2 months after Helen's diagnosis, something changed. Vanessa started calling her. Frequently. At first, I thought it was thoughtful. Maybe she genuinely wanted to spend time with Helen. But within weeks, her visits became surprisingly regular. She'd arrive carrying pastries or flowers, take Helen to lunch, offer to help organize closets. She posted cheerful selfies online. "Afternoon with my favorite neighbor." "Learning so much from this incredible woman. Grateful for wisdom across generations." Friends flooded the comments. "You're such a kind person. Helen is lucky to have you. What a beautiful friendship." I never commented. There wasn't anything to say. One Saturday morning, I arrived carrying replacement light bulbs Helen had asked me to install in the upstairs hallway. Vanessa's luxury SUV already sat in the driveway. Inside, I found Helen and Vanessa laughing over old family photographs. Vanessa looked up first. "Oh, Reagan. I didn't know you were coming." Helen smiled. "We're looking through albums." "I found some wonderful stories." I set the bag on the kitchen counter. "I'll replace those lights while you two visit." Vanessa immediately stood. "No, stay. We were just talking about the house." Something about the way she emphasized those last words caught my attention. "What about it?" She casually shrugged. "I asked Helen whether she'd ever consider selling." Helen answered before I could. "I told Vanessa the same thing I've told everyone else. This house isn't simply an asset. It's my life's work." Vanessa nodded. "Of course. But someday someone else will own it." Helen smiled politely. "Eventually." Vanessa glanced around the room. "Properties like this are worth a fortune now. I've sold 3 historic homes this year. People are paying unbelievable prices." Helen simply sipped her tea. "I've noticed." The conversation ended there, at least on the surface. Driving home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Vanessa had never shown the slightest interest in old houses before. She specialized in luxury condominiums and new construction. Historic preservation bored her. Or at least it used to. A week later, my parents invited both of us to dinner. Halfway through dessert, Dad leaned back in his chair. "So," he looked toward me, "still spending every weekend with Helen?" "Most weekends." He nodded. Then he turned toward Vanessa. "And you've been helping her too?" Vanessa smiled. "When I can." Mom reached across the table and squeezed Vanessa's hand. "She's been wonderful." Dad nodded approvingly. "That's what neighbors should do." I looked down at my plate. Neither of them asked what I'd been doing. Neither mentioned the zoning appeals, the grant applications, the contractor negotiations, the insurance claims. 3 years of legal work disappeared beneath a single compliment. I wasn't angry, just familiar with the feeling. Later that evening, Mom followed me into the kitchen while I loaded dishes into the dishwasher. "You know," she spoke carefully, "people naturally connect with Vanessa." I kept rinsing plates. "She's outgoing." "She's warm." I smiled faintly. "So am I." Mom hesitated. "You are. But you're quieter." It sometimes makes people overlook everything you're doing. I placed another plate into the rack. I've noticed. She sighed. I'm just saying you shouldn't take it personally. The strange part was that I wasn't hurt by strangers overlooking me. I was hurt because my own parents did. 2 weeks later, Helen asked me to accompany her to Thomas Avery's office. I need to update a few things. What things? She smiled. The responsible things. Thomas greeted us warmly. His office overlooked downtown Charlotte, lined with shelves of estate planning books and decades of framed legal certificates. He'd practiced probate law for almost 40 years. After we exchanged greetings, Helen handed him a handwritten checklist. Thomas adjusted his glasses. We'll review each item carefully. He looked toward me. Reagan, would you mind waiting in the conference room for a little while? Of course. I spent nearly an hour answering emails. Eventually, Thomas opened the conference room door. We're finished. Helen looked tired but peaceful. As we walked toward the parking garage, I asked, everything okay? She nodded. I simply updated documents. What kind? The kind everyone should update before they think they need to. I smiled. Fair enough. She looked at me for several seconds before speaking again. Reagan. Yes. If you ever handle your own estate planning. I know. I laughed. I'll read everything. No. She shook her head. I already know you'll read everything. I want you to insist everyone else reads it too. That sounded oddly specific. I almost asked another question. Instead, she changed the subject. Several months passed. Helen's health slowly declined. She became weaker. Walking across the porch required frequent rests. Some afternoons she fell asleep in her favorite chair while we reviewed paperwork. I'd quietly finish organizing files without waking her. One evening after she'd gone upstairs to rest, Thomas unexpectedly called my cell phone. Reagan. Yes. I have a favor to ask. What is it? If Helen asks you to witness any paperwork in the future, don't. I frowned. Why? Because you've become too important to her. You shouldn't serve as a witness. You should remain completely independent. That made legal sense. Witnesses needed neutrality. Still, something about his tone suggested there was another reason. I understand. Good. He paused. And Reagan, yes. Not every decision someone makes is meant to be explained immediately. Before I could ask another question, he politely ended the call. The following Monday, I stopped by Helen's house after work. She was sitting in the library with Thomas. Several neatly organized folders rested on the coffee table. Helen looked healthier than she had in weeks, almost relieved. Thomas stood when I entered. I was just leaving. As he gathered the folders, one thick document slid partially out of his leather briefcase. Instinctively, I bent to help him. For less than a second, the title page was visible. Warranty deed. Before I could read another word, Thomas gently took the document back, smiled, and slipped it into his briefcase. I'll take good care of this. He said it so naturally that I didn't think much of it. At least, not then. Helen Carter passed away on a quiet Sunday morning in October. There was no frantic phone call in the middle of the night, no dramatic final conversation. Just a message from Thomas Avery asking if I could meet him at the hospital after work. By the time I arrived, Helen was already gone. Thomas was standing near a window overlooking the parking lot, his hands folded in front of him. I'm sorry, Reagan. I nodded, but I couldn't speak. For several minutes, neither of us said anything. Finally, he handed me a sealed envelope. Helen asked me to give this to you after the funeral. I looked at the handwriting. It simply said, for Reagan. No last name, No explanation. Should I open it now? Thomas shook his head gently. She was very specific. After the funeral. I slipped the envelope into my purse. I'll honor her wishes. He smiled. I knew you would. Helen's funeral was held 4 days later at a small Episcopal church she had attended for decades. Nearly every pew was filled. Former neighbors, preservation volunteers, old friends, contractors who had worked on her house. Even city officials from the Historic District Commission attended. Listening to everyone speak about Helen, I realized something. No one talked about how much her home was worth. They talked about what happened inside it. The community dinners, holiday concerts, neighborhood meetings, fundraisers, graduation celebrations. That house had never simply been real estate. It had been a gathering place, a witness to countless lives. During the reception afterward, dozens of people approached me. Thank you for everything you did for Helen. I know how much she appreciated your help. You made those last few years easier. Their kindness meant more than they realized. Then Vanessa walked into the reception hall. She looked polished, elegant, confident. She hugged people effortlessly, accepted condolences, shared stories. Within minutes, she had become the center of nearly every conversation. I wasn't surprised. She had always possessed that gift. What surprised me was hearing her say this. Helen often told me I was like the daughter she never had. Several guests smiled warmly. One woman even replied, I could see that. I stared across the room. Helen had certainly cared about Vanessa, but I had never heard her say anything remotely like that. I considered correcting the story. Instead, I remained silent. The funeral wasn't about proving who had been closer. At least that was what I kept telling myself. 3 days later, Thomas invited several people to his office. Nothing unusual. Helen's remaining personal matters needed to be addressed. Vanessa arrived wearing an ivory business suit. Our parents came together. Richard looked unusually cheerful. Susan carried homemade cookies for everyone in the office. That struck me as odd. Most families arrived at estate meetings anxious. Mine looked almost celebratory. Thomas welcomed everyone into the conference room. There are several administrative matters to review. He carefully explained Helen's charitable donations, personal belongings, investment accounts, and instructions regarding a scholarship she had quietly funded for years. Everything appeared organized, predictable, professional. Then Thomas reached for another folder. This concerns the residents. The room became noticeably quieter. Vanessa leaned forward. Richard folded his hands together. Susan smiled without realizing she was smiling. Thomas opened the file. Helen transferred ownership before her passing. Before he could continue, Vanessa looked toward me. I told you. I knew she wanted everything settled. Thomas briefly glanced at her but continued reading. The property was conveyed through a recorded warranty deed. He slid several papers across the table. Only one copy reached me. It wasn't certified, just a standard photocopy. The pages looked slightly crooked. The county recording stamp was partially cut off at the edge. At the time, I barely noticed. Thomas continued explaining routine legal procedures. Vanessa interrupted. So, I'm free to move in whenever utilities are transferred, Thomas answered carefully. Once administrative matters are completed. Vanessa smiled broadly. Richard actually laughed. I knew Helen appreciated loyalty. Susan looked toward me. I'm sure Reagan understands. I blinked. Understands what? That Helen made the choice she believed was best. Nobody had actually shown me the ownership page yet. I looked down. The photocopy appeared to identify Vanessa Jenkins as owner. Everything happened so quickly that I didn't even question whether the copy was complete. I simply stared. 3 years. 3 years of helping Helen, 3 years of protecting the house, 3 years of believing I had simply been helping someone I cared about. And now it was over. Vanessa reached across the table. I hope this doesn't make things awkward. I looked at her. It isn't about me wanting the house. Then what is it about? I searched for the right words. I stopped. You thought what? She asked. I thought Helen wanted someone who loved the house. Vanessa smiled politely. I do. There wasn't enough certainty in her voice to convince me. Within 2 weeks, moving trucks arrived. Workers carried furniture inside. Painters refreshed bedrooms. Landscapers replaced flower beds Helen had personally maintained for years. The wraparound porch received expensive outdoor furniture that looked completely out of place. Every update seemed designed for photographs rather than living. One Saturday afternoon, I drove past the house almost without thinking. A luxury SUV sat in the driveway. Music drifted from the backyard. Vanessa was hosting a housewarming party. I watched from across the street for less than a minute. Then I drove away. That evening, my mother called. I heard you drove by. I did. You should let this go. I wasn't causing trouble. No, but people are talking. What people? Oh, she hesitated. Neighbors. I almost laughed. The neighbors who knew Helen? They'll understand. They're just worried there could be family tension. I leaned back on my sofa. There already is. Susan sighed. Reagan. Helen made her decision. You've always been independent. You have a wonderful career. You'll buy another beautiful house someday. Vanessa needs this more than you do. That sentence landed harder than she realized. Needs this more than you do. It sounded painfully familiar. As children, Vanessa needed the newer car. Vanessa needed more financial help. Vanessa needed support after bad investments. Vanessa needed understanding whenever she made mistakes. Apparently, now she needed Helen's home too. And what do I need? I quietly asked. There was a long silence. Finally, Mom answered. You don't need anything. You're strong. After we hung up, I sat in complete silence. Being strong had become the reason people believed I deserved less. The following Monday, Rachel Morgan stopped by my office carrying lunch. She had known me since law school. She also knew something was wrong before I said a single word. You haven't been sleeping. I forced a smile. I'm fine. No. She set 2 sandwiches on my desk. You're functioning. Different diagnosis. I laughed despite myself. She waited until I finished explaining everything: the funeral, the transfer, the housewarming party, the conversation with my parents. Finally, I handed her the photocopy Thomas had distributed during the meeting. I know it's over. I needed someone else to see it. Rachel adjusted her reading glasses and began examining every page. Unlike me, she wasn't reading for the story. She was reading like a litigation attorney. Slowly, methodically, line by line. She stopped halfway through the second page. What? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she flipped to the final page. Then back again. Finally, she looked up. Who gave you this copy? Thomas. At the estate meeting. She frowned. This isn't a certified copy. I know. The recording stamp is cropped. So, the certification block is missing. I leaned forward. What does that mean? It means this isn't the document I'd rely on. She tapped the margin with one finger. See this edge? I nodded. Something was cut off during copying. You don't know what? I don't know whether it matters. She carefully placed the pages back onto my desk. But if this involved my client? She looked directly into my eyes. Tai, I'd request the original recorded deed from the county before believing a single word printed on this photocopy. For the first time since Helen's funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt doubt. Not about Helen, about the paperwork. I barely slept that night, not because I suddenly believed the house belonged to me, because Rachel had pointed out something I should have noticed myself. I was a real estate attorney. I knew better than to rely on a photocopy. Yet grief had clouded my judgment. I'd accepted the document because I trusted the people handing it to me. By 7:30 the next morning, I was standing outside the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds office with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Government buildings always had the same feeling. Fluorescent lights, muted conversations, people carrying folders thick with paperwork. Most visitors were buying homes, recording mortgages, or researching property histories. For me, it felt strangely personal. A receptionist smiled politely. "Good morning. How can we help you? I'd like to request a certified copy of a recorded warranty deed." She handed me a request form. "Property address." I wrote Helen's address carefully. "Reason for request?" I paused for a moment. Then I simply wrote, "Property ownership verification." The receptionist reviewed the form before pointing toward a waiting area. "Someone from records will be with you shortly." About 10 minutes later, a man wearing a county identification badge approached. "I'm Marcus Bennett." He extended his hand. "Records supervisor." "I'm Reagan Jenkins." He smiled. "Let's see what we can find." Marcus led me into a public records room lined with computer terminals and shelves containing archived books that dated back decades. "Everything is digital now," he explained, "but we preserve original recordings too." He entered the parcel number into the county database. Within seconds, Helen Carter's property history appeared. Purchase records, tax adjustments, historic preservation filings, survey updates, everything was exactly where it should have been. Marcus clicked the most recent entry. "There it is." Recorded warranty deed. He printed a certified copy directly from the county archive. A raised certification seal was embossed onto the final page. Nothing had been cropped. Nothing was blurry. Everything was complete. He handed the packet to me. "There you go." I thanked him and walked to one of the public tables. For several minutes, I simply compared the certified copy to Rachel's photocopy. Page 1. Identical. Page 2. Identical. Page 3. I stopped. There was another paragraph. It hadn't appeared on my photocopy. I frowned. Maybe I had missed it. I flipped back and forth several times. No, the photocopy literally ended before that section. My heartbeat quickened. The additional paragraph began with ordinary legal language. Grantor. Conveyance. Consideration. Nothing unusual. Then I reached the ownership clause. I read it once, twice, 3 times. The words refused to make sense. "The property is hereby conveyed to Vanessa Jenkins and Reagan Elizabeth Jenkins as joint tenants with rights of survivorship." I stared at the page. Reagan Elizabeth Jenkins. Who was that? I whispered the name aloud. "I don't know anyone named Reagan Elizabeth Jenkins." Marcus happened to be walking past. He noticed my expression. "Everything okay?" I looked up. "I think there's another beneficiary." He stepped closer. "What do you mean?" I pointed to the clause. "This person. Reagan Elizabeth Jenkins. I've never heard of her." Marcus read the paragraph, then looked back at me. "What's your full legal name?" "Reagan Jenkins." "No." He smiled politely. "I mean your full legal name." I hesitated. It suddenly occurred to me that almost nobody used their complete legal name in everyday conversation. "My driver's license just says Reagan Jenkins." Marcus nodded. Do you know what your birth certificate says? I honestly don't. My passport. I'd have to check. He folded his arms. Before assuming this is someone else, I'd verify your legal identity. I laughed nervously. That seems unlikely. It happens more often than you'd think. People shorten names, drop middle names, use nicknames. The county records use whatever appears on the recorded instrument. I looked back at the deed. Reagan Elizabeth Jenkins. It still felt unfamiliar. I drove straight to my apartment. Inside a small fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet were the documents my parents had given me years earlier: birth certificate, passport, social security card, law school diploma, bar admission certificate. I pulled out the birth certificate first. For years, I'd rarely looked beyond the first line. Today I read every word. Name Reagan Elizabeth Jenkins. I froze. I picked up my passport. Reagan Elizabeth Jenkins. Social security records. Same. North Carolina bar membership. Same. Somewhere between college and adulthood, everyone, including me, had stopped using my middle name. Legally, it had never disappeared. I sank into the edge of my bed. Helen hadn't listed another woman. She had listed me. Within minutes, I called Rachel. You need to come over. 20 minutes later, she was sitting across from me at my dining table. Without saying a word, I slid the certified deed across to her. She read silently, then she smiled. I was wondering whether this was what we'd find. You suspected. I suspected something had been omitted. I didn't know what. I handed her my birth certificate. She compared both documents. Exact match. I leaned back. This can't be real. It absolutely can. But why wouldn't anyone tell me? Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the photocopy Vanessa had received, then the certified version. She placed them side by side. The omitted paragraph wasn't accidental. You think someone cropped it on purpose? I don't know. She chose her words carefully. But someone distributed an incomplete copy. Whether intentionally or carelessly, that omission completely changed how everyone understood ownership. I felt my stomach tighten. My parents celebrated. They congratulated Vanessa. They told me Helen had chosen her. Rachel looked directly at me. Did Thomas ever personally say Vanessa was the only owner? I replayed the meeting in my head. Every sentence, every pause, every document. Finally, no. He said the property had been transferred. He said ownership had been conveyed. But he never actually said she was the sole owner. Rachel nodded slowly. Interesting. The room suddenly became very quiet. For the first time, I realized something else. Vanessa had moved into the house immediately. She had hired contractors. She'd replaced landscaping. She'd begun renovations. She was acting as though she possessed unrestricted authority. What if she's already borrowed against the house? Rachel's expression changed instantly. That's exactly the question I'd ask. She opened her laptop. Let's see whether any recent financing documents have been recorded. Nothing appeared. No mortgage yet. I exhaled. Then she checked another database available to attorneys. Several minutes passed before she stopped typing. There. She turned the screen toward me. A commercial lender. Loan application status. Pending title review. Estimated closing date Friday. I checked the calendar. 3 days away. They're refinancing. Rachel nodded. It looks like Vanessa is trying to pull equity from the property. Can she... Rachel slowly closed the laptop. Not... She looked directly at me. Without every legal owner's signature. I stared at her. I never signed anything. I know. So what happens if she shows up at closing? Rachel smiled for the first time all morning. The title company is going to discover exactly what you discovered today. I thought about calling Vanessa immediately, demanding answers, confronting my parents. Instead, I looked at the certified deed resting between us. Helen had spent years teaching me one lesson: don't react before you understand the documents. Rachel must have seen the same thought cross my face. What are you thinking? I carefully placed the deed back into its envelope. I'm thinking Helen never rushed. Neither should we. Rachel nodded approvingly. Good. Because before we say a single word to your family, she reached for her phone. There's one person whose explanation I want to hear. Thomas Avery. Rachel called Thomas before either of us could second-guess the decision. He answered on the second ring. Thomas speaking. Good morning, Thomas. It's Rachel Morgan. There was a brief pause. Rachel. How can I help you? I'm sitting with Reagan. Another pause. I suspected I might hear from one of you. Rachel exchanged a glance with me. We've obtained the certified recorded deed. I assumed you eventually would. His voice remained calm. Too calm. Rachel leaned forward. We'd like to understand why the official deed identifies Reagan Elizabeth Jenkins as a joint owner, while the photocopy distributed after Helen's funeral omitted that entire section. Silence filled the line. Finally, Thomas spoke. I think that conversation deserves to happen in person. When? This afternoon. I'll clear my schedule. At 2:00, we walked into Thomas Avery's office. He looked older than I remembered only a few weeks earlier. Not physically, emotionally, as though he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. After we sat down, he placed 3 folders on the conference table. Each had a different label: estate planning notes, execution file, client instructions. He rested both hands on the folders. Before we begin, Reagan... I'm sorry. I frowned. For what? For allowing you to believe Helen had chosen someone else. You knew. I knew exactly what the recorded deed contained. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Then why didn't you tell me? Because I couldn't. Rachel spoke before I could. Attorney-client privilege. Thomas nodded. Helen's instructions were very specific. She wanted every legal document to speak for itself. Not me. I looked at him in disbelief. You watched my family celebrate. You watched me walk away believing I'd lost everything. I did. And I hated every minute of it. He opened the first folder. Helen anticipated this. He removed several pages of handwritten notes. The first page was dated almost 11 months before her death. In Helen's neat handwriting were the words, "Meeting with Thomas regarding future ownership." Thomas slid the page toward me. Read the highlighted paragraph. My eyes settled on a section underlined in blue ink. If I simply leave the house to Reagan, the family will accuse her of influencing me. If I leave it only to Vanessa, I reward appearances over integrity. Neither outcome reflects my values. I looked up slowly. Thomas continued. Helen didn't want either extreme. So why joint ownership? He opened the second folder. Because she believed 2 things. First, he handed me another page. She believed you genuinely loved that home. I swallowed hard. Second, he pointed to another paragraph. She believed Vanessa would eventually reveal whether she valued the house or only its financial value. I read Helen's own words. If Vanessa immediately tries to sell, refinance, or leverage the property without Reagan, then Reagan will know exactly why I structured ownership this way. The deed will protect the house better than I can. I felt my throat tighten. Helen hadn't simply transferred property, she had designed protection. Rachel quietly asked, Did Helen expect conflict? Thomas gave a sad smile. She expected pressure. Not necessarily conflict. What kind of pressure? He leaned back in his chair. The pressure families sometimes place on the person they believe will remain silent. Nobody spoke, because every person in that room knew exactly who Helen meant. Thomas opened the third folder. Inside were witness affidavits, execution records, signing checklists. Every page documented the day Helen signed the deed. There were 2 independent witnesses. They both confirmed Helen reviewed every page herself. He handed me another document. I also prepare execution memoranda after important signings. I scanned the typed notes. Client requested full legal names for all grantees. Client reviewed spelling personally. Client rejected abbreviated version. Client stated, "I want no confusion later." I remembered something from months earlier. Thomas had asked me to wait outside during that meeting. Helen insisted on my full legal name. He nodded. Personally. She corrected me. I originally prepared the draft using Reagan Jenkins. She crossed it out herself. What did she say? Thomas smiled despite himself. She said, he looked down at the notes, use every name exactly as it appears on her birth certificate. Details matter when families stop listening to one another. A lump formed in my throat. That sounded exactly like Helen. Rachel leaned forward. There's another issue. Thomas nodded. I know. The refinance? I looked between them. You already know. Thomas folded his hands. Vanessa called me. When? Last week. What did she want? She asked whether I had copies of Helen's closing documents, and I told her all recorded documents were available through the county. Was she worried? Thomas chose his words carefully. She asked several questions about refinancing. My stomach sank. What exactly did she ask? Whether ownership transferred cleanly? Whether additional signatures would ever be required? What did you tell her? The truth. That lenders determine their own underwriting requirements. Rachel smiled slightly. You avoided answering. Thomas nodded. I wasn't her attorney. I wasn't going to interpret documents for someone whose interests might conflict with another party. That sounded exactly like something an experienced estate lawyer would do. Professional, careful, thickly precise. Rachel opened her notebook. The lender has scheduled closing for Friday morning. Thomas looked unsurprised. I suspected they were moving quickly. Can they complete the refinance? He answered immediately. No. I stared at him. No. He reached into another folder and removed a copy of North Carolina's recording requirements. This isn't complicated. He pointed toward the deed. The property is owned jointly. One owner cannot mortgage the entire property without the other owner's consent. What if Vanessa signs anyway? She can attempt to. But no competent title company will ensure that transaction once ownership is verified. Rachel nodded. Exactly what I expected. Thomas looked directly at me. Reagan, this is important. Do not confront your family tonight. I frowned. Why not? Because once people realize they're wrong, they often begin rewriting history. They'll say they misunderstood. They'll claim the paperwork was confusing. They'll insist everyone acted in good faith. I knew he was right. Memories could change surprisingly fast when consequences appeared. But documents don't. Thomas smiled gently. Helen would be happy to hear you say that. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then I asked the question that had quietly followed me since Helen's funeral. Did Helen ever tell you why she trusted me? Thomas looked out the window before answering. Yes. What did she say? He opened one final notebook. Unlike the others, This one contained only handwritten meeting summaries. He located a page and turned it toward me. Client statement. Vanessa notices beautiful houses. Reagan notices the people trying to keep them standing. I know which person I trust when I'm gone. I couldn't stop the tears this time. Not because Helen had trusted me, because she'd understood me. Sometimes better than my own family had. Thomas quietly slid the notebook back into the folder. There's one more thing. Rachel looked up. What? Helen anticipated that the deed alone might not stop someone determined to move quickly. He reached into his briefcase. This time, instead of removing paperwork, he removed a sealed envelope. Across the front in Helen's familiar handwriting were 6 simple words. Deliver only if ownership is challenged. Thomas placed the envelope carefully in front of me, but didn't let go. According to Helen's written instructions, he looked directly into my eyes. This envelope is opened only after someone attempts to act as though you're not an owner. I stared at the envelope without touching it. Helen's handwriting was unmistakable, the same careful script she'd used to label every folder in her filing cabinet, every recipe card in her kitchen, every birthday card she'd ever mailed. For a moment it felt as though she were still sitting across from me. Rachel looked toward Thomas. Should she open it now? Thomas nodded once. That condition has been met. I carefully broke the seal. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter, a certified copy of Helen's personal instructions regarding the property, and a smaller sealed envelope addressed to any lender or title company if my intent is ever questioned. Rachel let out a quiet breath. Helen thought of everything. I unfolded the handwritten letter first. Reagan, if you're reading this, someone has already tried to convince you that paperwork says something it does not. Please don't become angry before you become certain. The documents will always defend themselves if people are willing to read them. You never loved my house because it was valuable. You loved it because you believed history deserved protection. Never let anyone convince you those are the same thing. I had to stop reading for a moment. The words blurred. Thomas waited patiently. Rachel quietly slid a tissue across the table. I laughed through the tears. Helen would probably tell me not to cry on original documents. Thomas smiled. She absolutely would. The second document was shorter. It confirmed that Helen had intentionally transferred the property into joint ownership because she wanted no major financial decision involving the house to occur without Reagan Elizabeth Jenkins participating. It wasn't a new deed. It didn't change ownership. It simply explained her reasoning in her own words. Rachel read it carefully. This won't replace the deed. It doesn't need to. It supports intent. Thomas nodded. Exactly. Then he pointed to the smaller sealed envelope. That one stays closed. Until Friday. I looked at him. Why? Because if the title company performs its job correctly, they'll never need to read it. And if they don't, then you'll have additional documentation. His confidence wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. The kind that came from 40 years of practicing law. Friday morning arrived sooner than I expected. Rachel picked me up just after 8. Neither of us talked much during the drive. I wasn't nervous about winning. I already knew what the document said. I was nervous about what the truth would cost. The closing was scheduled at a regional bank in downtown Charlotte. When we entered the conference room, Vanessa was already there. She wore a cream-colored designer suit and looked completely relaxed. Richard and Susan sat beside her. A loan officer organized paperwork into neat stacks. Across the table sat the bank's closing attorney. The moment Vanessa noticed me, her smile disappeared. "What are you doing here?" Rachel answered before I could. "My client has business related to the property." Vanessa looked confused. "What business?" The closing attorney raised a hand politely. "Let's begin." Everyone took their seats. The attorney reviewed the refinance documents one by one: loan amount, interest rate, property address, insurance verification. Everything proceeded routinely. Then he reached the title commitment. He paused, frowned, looked back at his computer, then back at the printed report. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Vanessa noticed. "Is something wrong?" The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the title company's representative participating by video conference. "I'm seeing 2 owners." The representative checked her screen. "So am I." Vanessa laughed lightly. "No. Only I own the property." The attorney slowly turned his monitor toward her. "The county records identify 2 current owners." Richard leaned forward. "There must be some mistake." Susan nodded quickly. "Exactly." "It's probably an old filing." The attorney shook his head. "No. This is the current recorded deed." He looked toward Vanessa. "It identifies Vanessa Jenkins." He paused again. "And Reagan, Elizabeth Jenkins." The room froze. Vanessa blinked twice. "What?" The attorney repeated himself. "The property is jointly owned." Richard immediately turned toward me. "What did you do?" His voice wasn't angry. It was panicked. I met his eyes calmly. "I requested the certified county record." "I didn't change anything." Vanessa looked directly at the attorney. "She's mistaken. My sister isn't listed." Rachel quietly opened her briefcase. Without a word, she placed the certified deed on the conference table. The attorney compared it with the electronic record, then nodded. "These match exactly." Vanessa's face lost its color. That wasn't on my copy," Rachel answered calmly. "I know." The attorney looked confused. "What copy?" Vanessa hesitated. "The one the estate attorney distributed." Rachel slid the photocopy beside the certified version. "Compare page 3. The attorney studied both documents. His expression changed immediately. "This photocopy is incomplete. It ends before the ownership clause." Richard stared at the pages. Susan covered her mouth. Neither of them said a word. The attorney looked coy toward Vanessa again. "When you completed your loan application, were you aware another owner existed?" Vanessa swallowed. I thought." "You thought what?" he asked gently. "I thought I owned it." The attorney nodded slowly. "Intent matters, but facts matter more." He closed the loan file. "I'm afraid we cannot proceed." The loan officer looked disappointed but unsurprised. "Our underwriting guidelines require every legal owner to participate. No exceptions." The attorney turned toward me. "Ms. Jenkins, would you be willing to confirm whether you consent to this refinance?" Every eye in the room shifted toward me. I could have answered immediately. Instead, I looked at Vanessa. She looked frightened. Not furious, not arrogant. Frightened. For the first time in years, she wasn't protected by charm, or assumptions, or our parents. She was standing alone with the truth. I spoke quietly. "I do not consent." The attorney simply nodded. "Then today's closing is terminated." He gathered the unsigned documents into a folder. "The lender will close the file unless ownership issues are resolved." Just like that, it was over. No shouting, no dramatic accusations, no courtroom speeches. Just one sentence based on one recorded document. As people slowly stood to leave, Richard walked toward me. "You embarrassed this family." I looked at him steadily. "I requested a public record. Nothing more." Susan's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't know." Before I could answer, Rachel spoke. "The certified deed has been publicly recorded for months. No one prevented you from reading it." Neither of my parents replied. They quietly walked out of the conference room. Vanessa remained behind. She stared at the empty chair where the loan officer had been sitting only minutes earlier. Finally, she looked at me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Reagan." I waited. "Can we talk?" Rachel glanced at me but said nothing. Vanessa took one slow breath. "Not here. Not with Mom and Dad. Just us." For the first time since Helen died, she wasn't asking as the favored daughter. She was asking as someone who had finally run out of places to hide. I didn't answer Vanessa immediately. The bank's conference room had almost emptied by then. The loan officer had already left to prepare cancellation paperwork. The closing attorney gathered the unsigned documents into a red file and excused himself. Only Rachel, Vanessa, and I remained. Vanessa looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. For years, confidence had been the first thing people noticed about her. Now it was gone. Rachel quietly closed her briefcase. I'll wait outside." She looked at me. "If you need anything, call." I nodded. As soon as the door closed, silence settled between us. Vanessa stared down at the polished conference table. "I really didn't know." I leaned back in my chair. "I believe you." She looked up surprised. "You do." "I believe you didn't know I was listed on the deed." She looked relieved. "But," I continued, "that doesn't explain everything else." The relief disappeared. "No, it doesn't." For nearly a minute she said nothing. Then she laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because she finally seemed too tired to keep pretending. "You know what the worst part is?" "What?" "I actually convinced myself I deserve that house." I didn't interrupt. I kept telling myself Helen loved me, that she appreciated me, that all those lunches and visits mattered. "They did matter," I said. "They just weren't the whole story." She nodded slowly. "I know." Then she looked directly at me. "I also knew you were there long before I ever showed up." That admission surprised me. "You knew." "Of course I knew. I saw your car there all the time. I knew you handled legal issues. I knew you spent weekends fixing problems. So why act like you were the only one helping?" She smiled bitterly. "Because everyone believed it. And once people start believing something, it's hard to give it back." Those words sounded painfully honest. Not flattering, not noble, just honest. Later that afternoon, Rachel and I drove to my parents' house. Neither of us had called ahead. When Susan opened the front door, she looked as though she had aged several years since breakfast. "I figured you'd come." Richard was sitting at the kitchen table. The certified deed lay in front of him. He had highlighted nearly every important sentence. He wasn't confused anymore. He understood exactly what it said. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, I sat across from him. "You've read it." He nodded. "Several times." "And?" He sighed heavily. "And I was wrong." Those 4 words should have felt satisfying. Instead, they simply felt late. Very late. I looked toward my mother. "When did you first realize my name was on the deed?" Susan lowered her eyes. Richard answered instead. "About 3 months ago." The room suddenly felt smaller. I stared at him. "You knew?" He nodded. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You knew for 3 months?" "And never told me." Richard rubbed his forehead. "We thought." "No." I interrupted quietly. "I don't want what you thought. I want what you did." He closed his eyes briefly. "We said nothing." "Why?" Susan finally spoke. "Because we believed it wouldn't matter." I frowned. "It mattered to me." "I know." Tears filled her eyes. "I know that now." I waited. She took a shaky breath. "We assumed
You'd never challenge Vanessa.
I couldn't tell whether that hurt more than discovering the truth itself.
You counted on me staying quiet.
Richard answered honestly.
Yes.
No excuses, no elaborate explanations, just one painful word.
Yes.
Richard slowly folded his hands. You've always been the dependable one. When something went wrong, you figured it out. When Vanessa struggled, you adjusted. You were stronger. I looked at him in disbelief. So strength became my punishment. He flinched.
I never thought about it like that.
I know.
That's the problem.
The kitchen fell silent again. Susan wiped her eyes. We never meant to hurt you.
I believe that.
She looked hopeful. I continued, but you kept making decisions that hurt me anyway. Neither of them argued, because they couldn't. I stood and walked toward the living room. Family photographs covered one wall. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, vacations, graduations. Looking closely, I noticed something strange. Vanessa stood in the center of almost every picture. I appeared at the edge, sometimes partially blocked, sometimes holding the camera instead of standing in front of it. I'd never noticed before, or maybe I'd simply stopped looking. Behind me, Richard quietly spoke. When Vanessa was little, I turned. She always needed reassurance. She cried when she lost. She compared herself to everyone. So we praised her. He paused.
You never asked for praise.
You just kept working. Susan nodded. We honestly believed you didn't need it. I smiled sadly. I didn't need more. I just needed equal. No one answered because there was nothing left to say. Richard stood and walked to a cabinet near the dining room. He removed a thin manila folder.
I suppose you should see this.
Inside were printed emails. The first one came from Thomas Avery's office. Subject: Recorded property transfer confirmation. Richard watched me read. The email summarized the recording information and attached a copy of the deed. The attachment name was still visible. Warranty, deed, Reagan, Elizabeth Jenkins, Vanessa Jenkins, PDF. The date matched exactly what Richard had told me. 3 months earlier. I slowly looked up. You opened this? Yes. You saw my full name? Yes. You understood what it meant? He hesitated.
Eventually.
Susan quietly added,
We hoped.
I looked at her.
We hoped nobody would question it.
The words came out barely above a whisper. We thought if everyone simply moved forward, everything would settle itself. I closed the folder.
So your plan was silence?
Richard lowered his head.
Yes.
I thought about Helen, about every conversation we'd ever had regarding documents, about her insistence that people ignore details whenever those details became inconvenient. She had seen this coming, not because she distrusted my family, because she understood human nature. Just then the front door opened. Vanessa walked inside. She looked from me to our parents.
I figured she'd be here.
Nobody answered. She slowly approached the dining table. I told them. I frowned. Told them what? The truth. She looked directly at me. I admitted I only started spending time with Helen after learning how much the house was worth. Richard closed his eyes. Susan began crying again. Vanessa continued. I didn't expect Helen to leave me anything. She laughed bitterly. I liked the idea of owning a house everyone admired. She looked around the room. I've spent my entire life chasing admiration. Then she looked back at me. And Mom and Dad spent my entire life helping me chase it. Nobody denied it, not even once. For the first time, there were no excuses, only honesty. Painful honesty. I quietly placed the email folder back onto the table. Then I looked at all three of them.
So, this wasn't a misunderstanding.
Richard swallowed.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't a paperwork error. No. It wasn't confusion. No.
I nodded slowly.
Then this wasn't a mistake.
I looked at each of them before finishing the sentence.
It was a decision.
No one argued, because every piece of evidence sitting on that table proved exactly the same thing. Nobody asked me to stay for dinner. Nobody suggested we pretend everything would be fine by the following weekend. For the first time in my life, my parents seemed to understand that some conversations couldn't be repaired with a casserole and an apology. I picked up my coat.
I'm leaving.
Susan stood immediately.
Reagan.
I turned toward her. I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough.
No, it isn't.
She nodded, accepting the answer instead of arguing with it.
I understand.
It was the first time I'd ever heard my mother say those words without following them, with a reason I should forgive someone else. As Rachel and I walked toward the front door, Richard spoke quietly.
What happens now?
I looked back.
That depends on what Vanessa wants.
The following Monday, Rachel filed a request for private mediation. Neither of us wanted years of litigation. Legally, I had several options. I could ask the court to order a partition sale. I could seek damages if I believed anyone had intentionally interfered with my ownership rights. I could even request reimbursement for expenses associated with unauthorized improvements made after Vanessa moved into the house. Every option was legal. None of them felt like the right place to begin. Rachel reviewed the strategy one last time.
Our goal isn't punishment. Our goal is a clean resolution.
I nodded.
Exactly. If Vanessa refuses, then we'll litigate. But she deserves one opportunity to resolve this fairly.
Rachel smiled.
I was hoping you'd say that.
The mediation took place 2 weeks later in a neutral office overlooking downtown Charlotte. Present were Rachel, Vanessa, Vanessa's attorney, a retired judge serving as mediator, and me. My parents weren't invited. This wasn't about family opinions anymore. It was about legal ownership. The mediator began by explaining the process.
No one is required to reach an agreement today. My job is simply to help both sides explore reasonable solutions.
Vanessa surprised everyone by speaking first.
I'd like to apologize.
She looked directly at me. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I owe you one. I listened quietly. I spent years believing attention was love. When people praised me, I thought that meant I'd earned something. I didn't question why. She took a slow breath. I should have. The mediator nodded.
Thank you.
He turned toward me.
Ms. Jenkins,
I appreciate the apology, I answered honestly. But today isn't about forgiveness. It's about resolving ownership. He smiled slightly. A very attorney-like answer. Rachel laughed under her breath. So I've been told. The mediator asked each side to explain what outcome they wanted. Vanessa surprised me again. I don't want to lose the house. She looked exhausted. I've already moved in.
I've invested money. I've made it my home.
I understood. Even though I disagreed with many of her choices, she had genuinely begun building a life there. Then the mediator looked at me.
What do you want?
I had thought about that question for days. I don't want the house. Everyone looked at me, including Rachel. I don't.
No.
I shook my head. I wanted what the house represented. Helen's trust. Fairness. The truth. I've already received those. The mediator leaned forward. So your objective is
I want the law respected. I want my ownership acknowledged. And I want a resolution that reflects the property's actual value. Vanessa stared at me. You'd sell your interest under the right conditions. She blinked. I thought you wanted the house. I wanted to know I hadn't imagined everything. I wanted proof that Helen saw me. I rested one hand on the certified deed lying in front of me. I have that now. The room became very quiet. Over the next several hours, accountants, appraisers, and attorneys reviewed financial records. An independent appraisal established the home's current fair market value. The number was significantly higher than anyone had expected. Charlotte's historic housing market had continued climbing since Helen signed the deed. The mediator made notes. Rachel reviewed spreadsheets. Vanessa's attorney performed calculations. Finally, the mediator summarized the proposal. Vanessa would purchase my 50% ownership interest based on the independently appraised value. No discounted family price. No emotional bargaining. No hidden conditions. Fair market value. Paid through a combination of savings and a conventional mortgage after proper title approval. Rachel added one additional requirement. My client also requests written acknowledgement that she has been a lawful co-owner since the date of recording. Vanessa's attorney looked at his client. Vanessa nodded immediately. That's fair. I added one more condition. I want every title record updated to reflect the completed transaction accurately. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Everything documented. The mediator smiled. I think Helen Carter would approve. I smiled back. I think she would too. After lunch, the final settlement agreement was drafted. It included every material term: recognition of joint ownership, withdrawal of the failed refinance application, sale of my ownership interest at appraised value, mutual release of future property claims, updated county recordings. Before anyone signed, Rachel carefully reviewed every page. She looked toward me. Take your time. I did. For nearly 20 minutes, I read every paragraph, every definition, every exhibit, every signature line. Finally, I laughed softly. The mediator looked curious. Something funny. Helen? What about her? She always said people get into trouble when they stop reading. The mediator smiled. Wise woman. When I finished reading, I signed. Vanessa signed after me. Then both attorneys. Then the mediator. Just like that, months of uncertainty ended with ink instead of arguments. As everyone packed their files, Vanessa remained seated. Can I ask you something? Of course. She hesitated. Are you ever going to forgive me? I considered this question carefully. I already have. She looked confused. You have. I don't want to carry anger for the rest of my life. She smiled faintly. Then, can we be sisters again? I took a long breath before answering. We can become something healthier, but we can't go backward. Her smile faded. I understand. I don't owe anyone unlimited access simply because we're related. She nodded slowly. I suppose Helen taught you that too. No. I smiled gently. Life did. 3 months later, the settlement had been fully completed. Funds had been transferred. Title records updated. The refinance closed legally under Vanessa's sole ownership. One afternoon, while sorting through my mail after work, I noticed a cream-colored envelope among the bills and advertisements. The return address belonged to Thomas Avery. Inside was a single handwritten note. Reagan. There is one final item Helen asked me to deliver after every legal matter regarding the house had been completely resolved. I think the time has finally come. Thomas folded behind the note was another sealed envelope. Across the front in Helen's familiar handwriting were 5 simple words. Open only after peace returns.
For several days, I left Helen's final envelope unopened. Not because I was afraid of what it contained, because strangely enough, I wasn't in a hurry anymore. For months, every decision had carried a deadline. Every conversation had involved lawyers, county records, or signatures. Now there was silence. The kind of silence that comes after a storm finally moves on. One Saturday morning, I drove to Freedom Park with a cup of coffee and Helen's envelope resting on the passenger seat. It felt like the right place. She had loved that park. We'd walked there dozens of times after medical appointments, usually ending up on the same bench overlooking the lake. I sat down, took a slow breath, and opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Nothing else. No hidden legal document. No surprise inheritance. Just Helen's words. Reagan, if you're reading this, then you've already discovered something I hoped would take you far less time than it probably did. You were never the backup plan. You were never my second choice. The deed was never meant to reward one person and punish another. It was designed to slow everyone down long enough for the truth to become impossible to ignore. I smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like Helen. She continued. People often believe justice arrives in dramatic moments. It usually doesn't. Most of the time, justice arrives because someone reads carefully, waits patiently, and refuses to surrender facts to louder voices. Never forget that. I paused. Those words described nearly every lesson she'd taught me over the previous 3 years. The letter continued. I loved Vanessa. I also loved your parents. None of them are evil people, but love without accountability becomes permission. I hoped the deed would force each of them to confront something they had avoided for years. Whether they accepted that opportunity was never mine to control. Only yours. I folded the page onto my lap and stared across the water. For months, I'd wondered whether Helen had been disappointed in my family. Now I understood. She hadn't written the deed out of anger. She had written it out of hope. Hope that truth might accomplish what conversations never had. The settlement money reached my account 2 weeks later. It was more money than I had ever received at one time in my life. Several friends immediately suggested vacations, luxury cars, investment properties. Instead, I found myself thinking about Helen. About the first afternoon we'd met over a stack of city violation notices, about all the elderly homeowners who quietly lost properties because they couldn't afford legal guidance. 3 months later, Rachel and I established the Helen Carter Homeownership Education Fund. It wasn't enormous. It wasn't intended to solve every housing problem in North Carolina. It simply provided free legal workshops for first-time homebuyers, senior homeowners, and families trying to understand deeds, titles, wills, and property transfers before misunderstandings became lawsuits. The first workshop attracted 23 people. The second drew almost 50. By the end of the year, local libraries and community centers were asking us to host additional sessions. Every presentation ended the same way. Read every document. Ask every question. Never assume someone else has already checked. I smiled every time I said it, because I knew exactly who had taught me those words. About 6 months after mediation, I found another historic house, not nearly as grand as Helen's Victorian. It was a modest 1920s craftsman bungalow on a quiet street lined with maple trees. The front porch needed repair. The roof would eventually need replacing. The kitchen hadn't been updated since the early 1990s. I loved it immediately. During the inspection, the real estate agent apologized repeatedly. I'm sorry it's not perfect. I smiled. I wasn't looking for perfect. I was looking for honest. The purchase closed without drama. No hidden clauses. No family arguments. No missing pages. Just clear documents reviewed line by line. Exactly the way Helen would have wanted.
My relationship with my parents changed. Not overnight, not dramatically. Richard called first. "I've been thinking." "I imagine you have." He sighed. "I spent years believing treating children differently was the same as loving them differently. I finally understand it wasn't." There wasn't much else to say. Understanding couldn't erase decades of unequal treatment, but it mattered that he stopped defending it. Susan wrote me a letter instead of calling. She admitted she had confused keeping peace with avoiding difficult conversations. "I thought silence protected this family," she wrote. "I see now that silence protected unhealthy patterns." I kept the letter. Not because it repaired everything, because it represented something new: responsibility. We met for lunch occasionally after that. Birthdays, some holidays, short visits, warm conversations. But I never returned to the old habit of sacrificing my own comfort simply to keep everyone else comfortable. The relationship became healthier precisely because it became smaller. Vanessa surprised me most. She completed the refinance legally. She kept the house. But something about her changed after mediation. Several months later, she called. "I have a strange question." "I'm listening." "Would you review a contract before I sign it?" I laughed. "Now you want the lawyer. I always needed the lawyer." "I just didn't appreciate her." That made both of us laugh. She had also stopped pretending to know everything. When she didn't understand something, she asked. When she made mistakes, she admitted them. We weren't best friends. We weren't especially close. But for the first time in our adult lives, we were honest with each other. Oddly enough, that was enough. One afternoon, nearly a year after Helen passed away, I visited her grave carrying fresh white lilies. I placed them beside the headstone and sat quietly for several minutes. "I finally bought a house." The breeze moved gently through the trees. "I think you'd like it." I smiled. "It's smaller, but it has good bones." "And yes, I read every document." I laughed softly to myself. People walking through the cemetery probably thought I was talking to empty air. Maybe I was. Or maybe gratitude doesn't require an answer. Before leaving, I rested one hand against the cool granite. "Thank you. Not for the house. For seeing me." Then I walked back toward my car. Not because my story had ended, but because it no longer needed to revolve around proving my worth to people who had once overlooked it. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying evidence. I wasn't preparing for another confrontation. I wasn't waiting for someone else to recognize my value. I already knew it. And that turned out to be the only ownership that could never be taken away. When families repeatedly ask one person to sacrifice because you're the strong one, it can become so familiar that it no longer feels unfair. But strength should never be treated as permission to overlook someone's needs, contributions, or rights. Healthy families encourage responsibility without expecting one person to quietly carry everyone else's burdens. If you've ever been the one who stayed calm, solved problems, or gave up opportunities to keep the peace, I hope this story reminds you that setting boundaries is not an act of revenge. Boundaries simply define where respect begins. Forgiveness can bring peace to your own heart, but forgiveness does not require restoring unlimited access to your life or ignoring harmful patterns. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive through dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it comes through patience, careful observation, honest conversations, and the courage to let facts speak louder than assumptions. And sometimes healing begins the moment you stop trying to earn the love that should have been freely given. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced favoritism, family pressure, or a moment when standing up for yourself changed everything? Share your experience in the comments. Your story may encourage someone else who needs to know they're not alone.
And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family resilience, justice, and healing, consider subscribing so we can continue these conversations together. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.